Today we're going to be talking about a cinematography fundamental, how to light a human face. The goal when practicing at home isn't necessarily to create a perfect looking image always. Of course, depending on your goal of the practice, it could be to make a perfect image. But for today, I had no real goal of making a beautiful looking image. My goal was just to be able to look at different modifiers, different ways of shaping light in order to get a different result on a human face. So the light that I decided to use and showcase today is the Nanlite FC120C RGB Spotlight. It's an FM mount, which is smaller than Bowen's, but Nanlite also has a bunch of modifiers that are great for this specific light. Some of the different modifiers that we used was the standard light cone, we used a light dome, we used a softbox with and without a grid, we also used their lantern softbox. Throughout this video, you see various different types of ways that the human face could look depending on how it is lit. A lot of the different examples that you'll see maybe don't tend to look very or drastically different, but there might be one thing here that looks a little different. One shadow feels a little bit softer. Maybe it doesn't hit the background as much. So as we go through some of these examples, pay attention to some of the details in the background, the shadows, maybe the foreground, the difference in light level from the foreground to the background. Those are the things you're going to want to look for, especially when looking at some of the different modifiers and different techniques used to light her face. So the setup that I have here is in my living room. It could kind of look like an interview setup, which is maybe the intention, but it was just to create a very simple approach using a window as sort of that motivating light and where I wanted to sort of key from. Starting off, no lights, nothing at all, just as natural as we can get. Obviously, you know her face is pretty much in the shadows here, which is understandable. So adding a bounce card with no real light hitting it won't do too much, but you'll notice that maybe there is a little bit of level bump, especially when it comes to the fill side. If you have natural ambient light and the only thing you have is a bounce, this is what you might be able to get as a result. Inherently, anytime you bounce ambient light off of white compared to any other color, you're going to get a return. White will emit light regardless. You'll see on the left side of frame, I kind of go in and out with the negative. You'll see the contrast levels change as I push it in and out. Adding neg and adding contrast is definitely a fundamental to cinematography and lighting for a human face. Alright, so starting off with lighting, I only used one light again, and I used a light stand that is fairly affordable that you can find on Amazon. You know, I have C-stands at home, but I didn't want to use them because I wanted to show that you could still light with a normal, $80 light stand that you could find on Amazon. I have it about 3/4 from her face, a little bit higher up, tilted down, to give a little bit of a Rembrandt triangle, but all the light is being motivated from that window. Obviously, you could tell it's way too harsh compared to the soft light from the window, but this is what a human face could look like when you shine a direct hard light at it from probably about 4 or 5 feet away. Next, we have a ceiling bounce. So the same exact light with the cone bouncing into the ceiling. Now, normally when I do ceiling bounces, I like to bounce from the key side. A lot of the times people tend to bounce from wherever because they think it's just sort of like a general ambient, light, which is fair. But when I want to bounce and kind of use that as maybe an additional key or a wrap, I always want to do it from the key side. You'll notice that this scene in particular is definitely a little bit flatter. There's not as much contrast, but it looks nice. It looks nice and soft. And if anything, maybe I would have bumped the level up a little bit more on the light. 501 reflector kits are a must to have in your kit or just have at home to play around with. You could have the neg, you could have gold, silver, diffusion, white bounce. There's so many different options that you could have. I use the 501 diffusion here to showcase what it looks like to have a hard light emit through a thicker diffusion. As you'll notice, this one is definitely the most flattering out of the ones that I've showed so far. And the reason is because you definitely get a good punch of light, but it is softened. It is cut down. Some of that harshness and ugliness is definitely not there anymore. Granted, I do think it is still a little too hard for my liking and my taste in particular, but if that's all you have is a light and a 501 reflector, this is something that you could utilize for diffusion. The other thing I want to mention is from the first shot of a direct cone to this one, you'll notice that the background is a little bit more level. Because the light is spaced out with the diffusion, and it is technically now a bigger source, the light is being emitted a little bit more evenly on the background. When it was just the cone, it was a bit more of like a spotlight, so you'll notice one spot in the background a little bit more bright than the other. The last example is the light cone again, but this time it's bouncing off a white bounce in the 5-in-1 reflector. So instead of the diffusion, I added the white bounce, and I just had the light aimed towards it again from the key side. I positioned it in a way where it's still kind of coming from that 3/4 higher angle. So depending on where you place the diffusion and the light and the angle and the height, it does play a role. Just because it's bounced doesn't mean it doesn't have directionality. This example is probably my favorite out of the 4 that I just showed. It has a good contrast ratio. I like the softness. It feels a little bit more even compared to the window. So if I were to go into an interview and only have this light and a 5-in-1 reflector, this is the setup that I would try to produce. So the light dome attachment is a really cool modifier to have to attaches to the cone itself. It softens it. It doesn't necessarily make it a bigger source, but it does round it out a bit, and it does make it significantly softer than the original cone just by itself. So the first example is the light dome going into a white bounce card. So similarly to the one we just saw before, it has a very similar look, but it is even softer now because it's not coming from a hard light to the white bounce and then going onto her face. It is already being diffused by the light dome, and that soft light is then being bounced into a white bounce, so it's almost being double diffused. So you'll notice that the shadows are way less contrasty. The fall off is way less significant. And the reason for that is because there's just less hard light and less contrast. So if you're going for a very ultra soft look, this could be a great option for you. So the next example is the light dome going through a 5-in-1 diffusion. And this one is quite nice actually. It gives a nice pop. It has sort of that high key look. This is a great example of if you're trying to get a nice soft look but have a nice pop to it. Next, we're going to the ceiling bounce. So the light dome going into the ceiling, again, same area as before, kind of from the same key side. Again, it doesn't really make that much of a huge difference, but it does give a general ambient lift. It does raise her face a little bit more compared to having no light, but there is less control, there's more spill, and you don't necessarily have a contrast or directionality. You're kind of just having a bit more of a wash. But it is a great way to light a room and a subject if that's the only way that you're able to actually do it. So last one is the light dome direct to the subject. And compared to the original where it was just the cone, you can notice that there is a slight bit of softness. Of course, it is still harsh. It's way too harsh for my liking, but it does give you a look into how you might be able to have a direct light onto a subject with a bit more softness. Or if you're trying to go for that hard light look but take some of the sting out, this could be a great option for you to kind of live within that hard light world but soften the edges a little bit and make it a bit more flattering. What I love about this softbox and this light is that it's very small. Granted, when you want to have a very soft source lighting, normally you would want a bigger source, a bigger soft source. But because we're only practicing at home and this is only to sharpen your skills in the fundamentals, you don't necessarily need to have a 6x, 8x, 12x. Having this softbox is a great way for you to just practice and understand directionality and quality of light. First one we're going to start with is the softbox with the grid direct to the subject. And the reason I started with this is because the grid will help control the spill of the light a little bit more. So you'll notice between the grid and without the grid, what it does to the background and also just her in general. There's definitely a bit more level. There's definitely a bit more brightness throughout the entire image. That could be good if you don't have maybe the brightness in the background that you need. Getting a little bit of extra level could be good without the grid. But if you want to control it a little bit more, I would definitely recommend adding a grid. The softbox is always a beautiful modifier to have in your kit, especially when you want to practice at home or if you want to do any sort of interview setup, talking head. Having a softbox will immediately give you that soft look that you're looking for. Now, a tip I want to share with softboxes in general, and something that I do regularly when I use softboxes on set, is that a lot of times people will aim the softbox directly at the subject, and which is fine. It'll give you a nice soft light, but something I like to do is almost pan the light in front of the subject. It's almost like skating the light in front of the subject, because if you think about it, with the softbox, there's a hard light and then it's being emitted through the cone and then going through that round diffusion. So inherently there's a lot of hard light still. So if that's being aimed directly at the subject, there's going to be still a bit of harshness. So when you pan it away from the subject, when you pan it in front of them, so the more residual light will emit on their face, it tends to be a lot softer. That's a technique I like to practice very often and something that I do very regularly. I will pan it slightly in front of them so that some of the harshness doesn't hit their face and more of the residual light will hit them instead. Next, we have the softbox going into a ceiling bounce. This is probably a technique that I wouldn't necessarily practice, but it is a great option in case you want to be able to have extreme softness, essentially, in a sort of flat level. You'll notice that in this image, there isn't very much contrast at all, but a very nice soft glow light on her face that kind of just raises and creates a more appealing image than without any light. The only thing to note with ceiling bounces or any sort of bounce in general, you do run the risk of not really having an eye light. So that's something to consider, is how important are eye lights compared to quality of light and directionality. Next example is the softbox going through a 5:1 diffusion. Call this double diffusion or double breaking. I love this technique because it really makes it the ultimate softness. It has beautiful qualities to it. It brings up the size of the light itself by going through the 5:1 diffusion. It essentially doubles in size, which makes it much softer. The contrast is quite nice because of the direction of the light and the diffusion, but the shadow itself and the harshness isn't really there anymore. So this is probably one of my favorite techniques if you're going for extreme softness. And what's really nice is that you could see the sort of wrapping light coming from the window all the way around to the right side of her face. It does feel like the light is coming from the window because of the intensity. The next example is the softbox going into a white bounce card, or the 5:1 bounce. Again, similar to the ceiling bounce, this is probably a technique that I wouldn't practice, but it gives you a good example and a good idea of what it could look like. I'd say bounces in general are very good if you have a lighting fixture that has a ton of power. Because of how much light is being lost through the bounce, you really do need power to be able to create a sustainable look, depending on the output of the background and how much level you need to balance. But because it's being bounced and being bounced by an already diffused light, you'll notice that the shadows are almost non-existent. It's very flat, it's very soft, and again, depending on the directionality, maybe you move it over a little bit more 3/4 to get some more contrast, or you add a little bit more neg. The last modifier we're going to go over is the lantern softbox. Lanterns are one of my favorite modifiers to have no matter where I go. It's a modifier that you could use in multiple different ways, and it is probably one of the most versatile modifiers that you could own. So I highly recommend, if you do have a monolight and it does have the availability to attach a lantern to it, I would definitely recommend picking up one of those lanterns. So the first we're going to go over is the lantern direct to the subject. So think about this as almost like the same thing with the softbox. Only thing to note is that because of the style of the lantern, and that more light is emitted through the softbox, and because there's more diffusion being illuminated, there's definitely a lot more light being bounced around the room. There's definitely less control with a lantern, but that does make it a little bit more of a bigger source, which can make it a little bit softer. It does give you a very good eye light, it gives you good shape, so if this is how you want to utilize a lantern, I definitely think that this could be a good option for you. My favorite technique with lanterns are overheads, and the reason for that is because of the style of a lantern and it kind of illuminating 360, it gives you a good balance of level in the background, midground, and foreground, and on the subject. It essentially just raises the ambient level of the entire space while also keeping some directionality on your subject. So this is probably one of my favorite looks, is the overhead lantern. Now, one thing to note about overhead lighting is you do have to be careful a little bit of how high it is, where it is, and how much overhead compared to how much in front of the subject. The reason why to note that is because the more it is directly overhead, the more raccoony there will be in the shadows of the eyes. So if the light is directly overhead, you will get way more raccoon eyes. But if it is slightly in front of the subject and maybe 3/4 again, you will definitely get a way better, softer wrap light that you see here. Now, next is the same exact positioning overhead, but I added this skirt. And if you aren't familiar with what skirts are, they're essentially black material that wrap around the lantern to cut the sort of 360 illuminating light. And it makes it way more directional, essentially just coming straight down. So this is a great technique if you want to control light even more, similar to the grid of the softbox. If you notice between this shot and the one before, there is a big difference in the level of the background, but also just the quality of light on her face as well. But again, depending on the location, depending on the style you're going for, maybe you want to control the light, maybe you don't. But this is a great way for you to understand what skirts do and how you might be able to utilize them in your practice. The last thing I want to play with is the exact same thing, the lantern with the skirt, but playing with a bounce underneath. This is a great way to see if you might want to add some fill underneath the chin, adding a bit of wrapping light, This is great for beauty or fashion where you don't really want a lot of shadows underneath the chin, or you want to just fill in a bit more. This is what I recommend everyone doing at home if they want to study how to light a human face. Practice. Again, you don't need all the equipment in the world. All you need is a single light, and if you have one modifier, if you have two modifiers, whatever you have, there are options and ways for you to play with and give you multiple different results. You just have to get creative and understand how you are able to use what you have to your advantage. So that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you found a little insight in how you might be able to go and practice at home with the equipment that you do have, and how you're able to experiment and maybe try some new techniques that maybe you haven't thought of. Hopefully you guys have a great day. See you next time. Peace out.